So in this video, we're going to talk about fiscal policy. Specifically, we're going to take a look at how to calculate the government expenditure and the government tax multipliers. And when calculating these multipliers, the government expenditure and the government tax multipliers, the key takeaway is to understand when the government, an increase in government expenditure is going to be most impactful. So when we calculate these multipliers, what we're trying to understand is, given a $1 increase in government expenditure for the government expenditure multiplier, and given a $1 decrease in taxes when we find the government tax multiplier, we want to see the effect on real GDP, on output. However, that effect on output is going to depend on the economic climate that the state of the economy is currently in when government expenditure increases or when the tax cuts take place. So the reason it's tough to definitively determine what the multiplier, the value of the multiplier is going to be, is because we have counterbalancing effects when expansionary fiscal policy is implemented. Well, for government expenditure, well, if government expenditure increases, well, if that increase in expenditure, if that's not offset by a decrease or an increase in taxes, well, then there's going to be this crowding out problem. There's a previous video that highlights the crowding out effect and what ends up happening. But essentially, there's an increase in real interest rates due to government borrowing. This increase in real interest rates makes it more costly for households and firms to take out a loan. And if it's more costly for them to take out a loan, there's going to be less investment specifically into capital. However, the reason we have these expansionary fiscal policies is to stimulate spending, specifically to stimulate domestic consumption, therefore having domestic firms have to produce the increase in consumption, leading to increase in output for the domestic economy. Okay, so when talking about fiscal policy, we're essentially talking about the federal government's budget. And when an expansionary fiscal policy is implemented, well, this results in either higher government expenditure or a decrease in taxes, lower taxes. And the effects of these policy, to understand the effects of these policy, we're going to have to first take a look at the federal budget. The federal government's budget is made up of the tax revenues that are collected, and the money that the government spends or how the government uses those tax revenues. So that's government spending. So essentially, we've seen this before. We'll simplify this into tax revenues being equal to T and government spending being equal to G. When tax revenues are greater than government spending, meaning the difference between T and G is greater than zero, call that a budget surplus. However, we haven't ran a federal government surplus in 25 plus years. Realistically, and what we've been doing for those past 25 years is running a federal budget deficit, meaning our government expenditure has been greater than our tax revenue collected. So we call this a budget deficit. And the reason I bring this up is because when there's a deficit, when there's a federal budget deficit, one, it leads to an increase in overall national debt. And two, this deficit has to be made up somehow. How is it made up? Usually through borrowing. Specifically borrowing by the federal government. And so when there is this borrowing by the government, well, the federal government has to take out a loan, so they have to find a creditor for the loan. So they enter the credit market. When that happens, we've talked about crowding out. Well, when that happens, it causes demand for credit to increase, which drives up the real interest rate that has to be paid. So you've had a slide on this, or a video on the crowding out effect. The takeaway from here is that when the private demand for credit, this is private demand for credit, this is private households and firms, not the federal government demand for credit. This light blue demand for credit does not include demand for credit by the government, by the federal government. This dark blue line does. This dark blue demand for credit curve includes the demand for credit by the federal government. And so when there's this increase in the demand for credit, it drives interest rates up. When the interest rate drives up, now it was previously at 5%, now it's at 6% at a price of loans. That's what the interest rate is. It's just essentially the price of loans. When the price of loans increases, then the amount of private investment, as given by this light blue demand curve, well, at this now higher interest rate, the amount of credit demanded is now going to be lower than where it was previously. Previously it was at 100. Now, because the interest rates increased by 1%, from 5% to 6%, quantity demanded of credit by private households and firms is actually going to decrease to, let's call this $80 billion. That decrease in private credit that's demanded as given by this light blue demand curve, well, that $20 billion billion dollars of credit that's crowded out, well, that's going to amount in a loss of investment by private households and firms, which is going to result in lower amounts of capital that can be used for productive purposes. And we can see this when we derived our investment equation. So we did some algebraic manipulation here. All we did was we set these two equations equal to each other, and then we solved for that. So actually, let's go through that. Let's go through and do that real quick. So the way we solved for this was, if we take a look over here, we set these two equations equal to one another. And how do we solve for I? Well, we subtracted c's from both sides, which cancel out the c's. We then tried to just isolate this investment term, this I. So what do? We subtract g from both sides, government expenditure, which cancels this out here. We have g over here. And then we subtracted our net exports, the difference between our exports and our imports. So we essentially subtract negative x minus m from both sides. And so when we solve for this right-hand side of the equation here, well, we're left with Our consumption's gone. We have our savings, which we find here. Then the difference between our taxes and our government expenditure. And then we just distribute this negative sign such that we're left with imports minus exports. So we just get the reverse, or this side just distributing through the negative sign. So we're left with these three pieces. Investment being comprised of the amount of savings by private households and firms. The federal budget, the government's federal budget, whether there's a surplus or a deficit. And then the trading with the rest of the world, essentially. And so what we do in the next slide is we assume that it's a closed economy, or imports are exactly equal to exports. Either way, we're just trying to get rid of this last term here, just to make things a little bit more simple. So if we assume that it's a closed economy, meaning imports and exports are both equal to zero, then we're just left with this investment equation where the amount of investment we have in capital is equal to savings plus this federal government either deficit or surplus. And so when there is crowding out, when crowding out occurs, it's because government expenditures are greater than the tax revenues that are collected, meaning the federal government has to borrow, and they have to borrow, drives up the demand curve, increasing interest rates, crowding out, again, some credit that would have been used for investment by private households and firms. Okay, and we can see that because if just this piece, right here, this federal budget component, the difference between taxes and government revenue, if that's negative, well then, given the same level of savings, investment's actually going to be lower when this is less than zero.